The stagecoach arrived long after sunset. Most people waiting at the station had already gone home, leaving only one tall cowboy standing beneath the faded wooden awning. Snow clouds rolled over the Montana mountains, and the cold wind carried the smell of pine through Copper Ridge. Mason Crowe folded the worn photograph back into his coat pocket. He had stared at it so many times that the woman's face had almost disappeared. His future wife, a stranger, a woman he expected to share his cabin, not his heart. When the coach finally stopped, the door opened slowly. One woman stepped down carrying a single weathered suitcase. Her boots were dusty from weeks of travel. Loose strands of chestnut hair escaped beneath her bonnet. She looked directly at Mason without lowering her eyes. Neither of them smiled. If you've ever wondered whether two strangers can truly become home for each other, stay with this story until the end. Mason silently lifted her suitcase onto his horse before climbing into the saddle. "You can ride behind me," he said. She nodded once. "My name is Ivy Langston." "I know." Nothing more was said. The long trail climbed into the mountains while daylight slowly disappeared behind dark pines. Ivy held the saddle instead of wrapping her arms around him. The distance between them felt as wide as the valley below. At last, the cabin appeared. Old logs, one chimney, one lonely lantern glowing beside the door. No flowers, no curtains, nothing that suggested laughter had ever lived there. Mason carried her suitcase inside. "The bedroom is yours," he said. "I sleep upstairs." "You don't have to." "I do." He turned away before she could answer. The cabin felt neat enough to satisfy any traveler. Yet every shelf, every chair, every tool sat in exactly the same place, as though moving anything would disturb memories no one could see. Ivy slowly opened her suitcase. Instead of dresses, the first thing she removed was a folded white tablecloth embroidered with tiny blue wildflowers. She carefully spread it across the rough wooden table. Mason stopped walking. His eyes rested on the cloth for several long seconds before he quietly looked away. Neither mentioned it. Supper was simple. Beans, fresh bread, hot coffee. Mason waited until Ivy sat before touching his food, though he never explained why. The silence between them was uncomfortable, but not cruel. It carried questions neither was ready to ask. Later that night, Ivy unpacked paper, ink, and several unfinished letters. She sat beside the lantern, writing to her younger sister back in Missouri. Her handwriting flowed across the page with remarkable precision. Above her, the loft floor creaked. Mason lay awake. Through a narrow gap between the boards, he watched the steady movement of her hand. Those graceful letters did not belong to someone who had spent her life washing clothes or cooking over fires. She was hiding something. The thought stayed with him until sleep finally came. The next morning arrived wrapped in silver frost. Before sunrise, Ivy had already lit the stove, warmed the cabin, and brewed fresh coffee. Mason climbed down quietly. The hot cup waited beside his chair. He picked it up, drank every drop, then left without speaking. Day after day, the same quiet routine settled over the cabin. Ivy cooked, cleaned, mended worn shirts, kept the fire alive. Mason repaired fences, chopped wood, and cared for the horses until darkness returned. Words remained few. Yet Ivy noticed things. He always hung his coat on the same peg, always checked the door twice before sleeping, always paused outside her bedroom before climbing to the loft, as though making certain she felt safe. She never mentioned any of it. One afternoon, the first heavy snowstorm swept across the mountains. By sunset, the trail had disappeared beneath deep white drifts. Mason had not returned. Ivy reheated the stew, then reheated it again. Outside, the wind struck the cabin walls hard enough to rattle the windows. Each passing minute stretched longer than the last. At last, the door burst open. Mason stumbled inside, covered in snow. Ice clung to his beard. His right shoulder hung lower than the other. He tried to hide the pain. "You should have eaten," he muttered. "I wasn't hungry." She filled a cup with hot coffee and placed it gently into his frozen hands. For the first time, their fingers touched. Neither pulled away immediately. Steam drifted between them. The room remained silent, but something invisible cracked open. Mason slowly lifted his eyes. He looked at Ivy as though he were seeing her for the very first time. Then, quietly, almost uncertainly, he spoke. "I think this is the warmest coffee I've ever had." Outside, the storm kept raging across the mountain. Inside the cabin, another storm had only just begun. Snow covered the mountain for 3 straight weeks. The trail disappeared beneath white drifts so deep that even the tallest fence posts looked like broken sticks. The cabin became its own little world, surrounded by endless silence and frozen trees. Every morning, Ivy rose before daylight. She built the fire, ground fresh coffee, cooked breakfast before Mason climbed down from the loft. He never asked her to. She simply did. One morning, she noticed him rubbing his right shoulder while he thought she wasn't looking. The movement was small, but his face tightened before he quickly pulled his shirt over it. She said nothing. Instead, she quietly searched through her suitcase after he left. Wrapped inside a linen cloth sat a small brown bottle. Her late mother's homemade liniment, camphor, pine oil, wild herbs gathered from the hills back east. That evening, she placed it beside his coffee cup. "My mother swore by it," she said. Mason looked at the bottle. "You've been watching. You've been hurting." He stared into the fire. Finally, he slipped the bottle into his coat pocket. The next morning, it returned to the table, half empty. No words were exchanged, but Ivy noticed he lifted his arm a little easier. If this story has touched your heart so far, tell us where you're watching from. Stories like these travel farther because of people like you. The days settled into gentle routines. Mason repaired the rocking chair without saying a word. Ivy found it standing perfectly level beside the fire. She quietly smiled. The following afternoon, she reorganized the woodshed. Heavy logs sat where his injured shoulder would not need to reach. Kindling rested beside the door. When he returned home, he stopped in the snow, staring at the neat stacks. "You did this. It seemed easier." He nodded once. "It is nothing more." That night, the wind whistled around the cabin. Ivy sat writing another letter beside the lantern. From above came a restless voice, soft, broken, almost impossible to hear. "Hannah." The name drifted through the darkness. Then silence returned. Ivy lowered her pen. She did not cry. She did not ask. She simply folded the unfinished letter and blew out the lamp. Morning arrived, pale and cold. Mason looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. Without speaking, Ivy poured him an extra cup of coffee. He looked at it. "You knew I slept poorly." "I guessed." His fingers tightened around the warm tin cup. "My wife's name was Hannah." The words came so quietly she almost missed them. Mason stared toward the window where snow drifted across the yard. "She died 12 winters ago." He swallowed once. "I left for medicine." His voice stopped. "The storm trapped me." He never finished the sentence. He did not need to. The empty chair beside the table finished it for him. Ivy reached for her sewing instead of his hand. Some grief could only survive if it was allowed to breathe. Several days passed before either mentioned it again. Late one evening, Mason noticed Ivy carefully folding another letter. "You write beautifully," my father insisted. He was a teacher. She slowly shook her head. "A lawyer?" Mason looked surprised. "I copied legal papers before I married." "You never told me. You never asked." He lowered his eyes. The answer stayed with him long after supper ended. As Christmas drew near, Ivy swept beneath the ladder leading to the loft. The broom caught against a small wooden box hidden in the shadows. She hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside rested an old wedding ring, a faded photograph, a neatly folded letter. She closed the box immediately without reading a single word. She slid it back exactly where she had found it. That evening, Mason hardly spoke. Perhaps he knew. Perhaps he simply remembered. Neither said anything. The cabin seemed quieter than ever. A few nights later, snow tapped softly against the windows while the fire burned low, and Mason sharpened his hunting knife beside the stove. The scraping stopped. "I've spent 12 years trying not to remember." Ivy remained still. "I thought marrying again would give this place another pair of hands." He looked toward her. Instead, it gave it another heartbeat. Ivy slowly placed her sewing into her lap. "My husband never struck me." Mason listened. "He simply lived as though I wasn't standing beside him." The fire cracked loudly. "When he died, I realized I had forgotten what it felt like to matter." Mason stared into the glowing coals. "So, we were both hiding." She nodded for different reasons. A long silence settled between them. Not empty, not uncomfortable, simply shared. At last, Mason stood. He walked toward the window where snow drifted beneath the moonlight. Without turning around, he spoke. "Tomorrow I'll clear the trail to the spring. You don't have to, I know." He smiled so slightly it almost disappeared. "But I want your walk to be easier." Ivy looked down before he could see her eyes shine in the firelight. The mountain remained frozen outside. Inside, something much older had finally begun to thaw. Before either of them realized it, the hardest winter of their lives was quietly becoming the beginning of something neither had expected. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. Spring announced itself with the sound of moving water. The creek below the cabin finally broke free from winter ice, rushing through the valley with a voice neither of them had heard in months. Morning sunlight poured across the snow, leaving patches of dark earth along the hillsides. Ivy stepped onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee. Mason was already outside. He leaned against the fence, his shoulders stronger now, watching the mountains wake beneath the rising sun. "You healed faster than you expected. I had a good nurse." She smiled without answering. The quiet between them no longer felt empty. It felt lived in. Life settled into steady days. They planted vegetables beside the cabin, repaired broken fences, gathered firewood for another winter that would surely come. Neighbors who once believed Mason wanted nothing to do with anyone slowly began stopping by. Some came to trade, some came only to talk. Most left surprised to find laughter inside the lonely cabin. One afternoon, 3 riders appeared on the trail. Mason recognized them immediately, a railroad company survey crew. The man leading them carried rolled maps beneath his arm. "We're looking for Mason Crowe." "I'm here." The stranger removed his hat. "My name is Victor Lang, Northern Western Railway." Mason's jaw tightened. "We're not selling." Victor slowly shook his head. "I'm afraid this isn't a request." He handed over several folded papers. "The company believes part of your land belongs to the railroad." Mason unfolded the documents. Even before reading them, something felt wrong. The government seal looked poorly stamped. The signatures lacked proper spacing. The dates did not match. He carried the papers inside without another word. Ivy spread them across the kitchen table. She studied every line, every signature, every seal. Then she quietly looked up. "These papers are false." Mason frowned. "You're certain?" "I copied legal records for years." She tapped one corner. "This seal belongs to another county." Another page. "The survey number doesn't exist." Then another. "The witness signed 6 months after he supposedly died." Mason stared at her. "You can prove it." "I can." 3 days later, they rode into Copper Creek together. The courthouse buzzed with farmers, ranchers, merchants, and railroad men. Victor Lang stood near the judge's bench with 2 lawyers. He smiled the moment Mason entered. The smile disappeared when Ivy stepped beside him carrying a leather folder. Judge Levi Porter opened the hearing. Lang confidently presented the railroad's claim. Then Ivy quietly stood. She placed one document after another before the judge. Original land records, county filings, marriage certificate, certified property surveys. Finally, she laid down the railroad papers. These documents contain 3 separate legal frauds. The courtroom became silent. She pointed calmly. The seal is incorrect. The witness could not have signed. The land description belongs to another valley. Judge Porter adjusted his spectacles. He examined every page carefully. Then he looked toward Lang. Can you explain these differences? Lang's face lost its color. One of his own surveyors slowly stepped forward. I can. Every head turned. The older man removed his hat. I drew the original map 15 years ago. He pointed toward Ivy's documents. Those are genuine. Then toward Lang's. These were altered. Lang tried to interrupt. The surveyor continued. I warned the company this family owned the land legally. Judge Porter struck the bench with his gavel. The railroad's claim is dismissed immediately. He turned toward Lang. I am also ordering a criminal investigation into these documents. The courtroom erupted. Lang hurried toward the door without looking back. Mason remained seated. For several seconds he could not move his land, his home, everything he had built safe. When they stepped outside, warm spring wind drifted through the streets. Mason stopped beside the hitching rail. He looked at Ivy. I would have lost everything. She gently shook her head. No, you saved this place. We saved it. The single word settled between them with quiet certainty. Weeks later, the mountain had turned green. Wild flowers covered the meadow below the cabin. Fresh curtains hung inside the windows. A small vegetable garden stretched beside the porch. The lonely cabin no longer looked abandoned. It looked loved. One evening, Mason walked slowly onto the porch, carrying something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Ivy. Inside rested a beautifully carved bluebird. Every feather had been shaped by hand. I made it during the winter. She traced the smooth wood with her fingertips. It's beautiful. So are the mornings since you arrived. He looked across the valley before speaking again. I thought I was asking for a wife. His voice remained steady. The truth is, I was asking someone to save me from a life that had already ended. Ivy reached for his weathered hand. You saved me too. Neither moved. The wind carried the scent of pine across the mountains. Below them, the creek sparkled beneath the evening sun. Mason gently closed his fingers around hers. This time, neither of them let go. The cabin behind them stood warm beneath its rising chimney smoke, while the last light settled across the valley. For the first time in many years, tomorrow no longer looked empty. If this story stayed with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves heartfelt Wild West stories.